Some doors in a hospital aren't meant to be opened, not because they're locked, but because something on the other side is still waiting. Tonight, we step into room 13, a place forgotten by everyone, except the one who never left. Crescent Hill Medical Center sat on the edge of town like a forgotten monument, a relic of the 1960s with beige walls, flickering tomb lights, and hallways that hummed with an eerie low electrical buzz that never seemed to stop. And on the night Dr. Arin Malone began his overnight rotation, he felt the kind of stillness that made hospitals in America feel less like places for healing and more like traps for the dying. He had worked night shifts before, but nothing felt like Crescent Hill. Everything echoed too loudly, the airflow felt wrong, and every few minutes a cold draft crept across the floor, even though the AC vents weren't functioning properly. And the building's age gave it a personality all its own. The kind that made nurses whisper stories about the old wing, the part of the hospital that had been shut down decades ago after a fire gutted half the floor, leaving certain rooms permanently sealed, including room 13, a room everyone avoided so deliberately that even the cleaning staff refused to mop near it, brushing past the door with hurried footsteps and muttering things like, "Don't look at it too long," or "That door listens." And at first, Arin dismissed it all as typical hospital superstitions, the kind every U.S. resident heard when they started working nights. But then, he started seeing it. Every night at exactly 2:45 a.m., as soon as the hallway lights flickered twice, a shadow would drift across the far end of the corridor, not moving like a person, not even like a ghost, but like smoke being dragged underwater, stretching and bending in impossible ways, sliding across the polished linoleum floor and disappearing beneath the door of room 13. And on the first night, Arin simply blinked and looked away, telling himself he was exhausted and imagining things. On the second night, he froze when he saw it again, locking eyes with the moving shape as a sudden cold breeze swept past him, despite the fact that all windows were sealed shut. And on the third night, the shadow paused mid-hallway, turning its faceless head toward him with an awareness that made his stomach drop as if he'd been plunged into icy water. And even though he tried to tell himself it was sleep deprivation or stress, something deep inside him, something ancient and instinctive, whispered that the shadow knew him, recognized him, maybe even expected him. And that terrified him more than anything else in his life. Yet fear didn't stop his curiosity. American hospitals had their fair share of urban legends, but nothing ever stuck the way room 13 stuck in his mind. And the older staff weren't helping, especially Nurse Hargrove, a woman who had been working at Crescent Hill since the late 80s, who always went silent whenever someone mentioned the old wing, her face tightening with a look people usually got when remembering tragedies they wished had stayed buried. And once when Arin casually asked why room 13 was sealed, she had looked him dead in the eyes and said, "If you hear anything from that room, you keep walking. Whatever died in there doesn't know it's dead." Then walked away without waiting for a response, leaving him with a chill that lingered long after she was gone. By the fourth night, Arin was no longer content pretending it was all in his head, and when the clock on the corridor wall clicked from 2:44 to 2:45 a.m., he stepped into the middle of the hallway and forced himself to watch, gripping his clipboard so tightly his knuckles turned white. And right on cue, the lights flickered twice, something they only did during those few seconds every night, before the shadow materialized again, this time rising slightly above the ground like a figure suspended by invisible strings, stretching across the hall before gliding toward the sealed door. But just before slipping underneath it, the shadow stopped and turned again toward Arin.
and this time he felt a sudden pressure behind his eyes, like a whisper was being forced directly into his brain, though no sound reached his ears. And then the shadow vanished into the room. Arin felt nauseous, dizzy, and deeply unsettled, but he also felt something else, a pull, a magnetic urge to approach the door. And so he did, afraid of what he might find, and even more afraid of leaving the mystery unsolved, because he had grown up in Ohio with a father and grandfather who both worked as doctors, men who had taught him never to run from the unknown, telling him that the medical field required courage, logic, and endurance. But none of those lessons prepared him for the moment he reached room 13 and placed his hand on the wooden door, feeling warmth, actual human warmth radiating from the other side of the wood, as though someone inside had just pressed their palm exactly on the same spot. And his breath caught in his chest because the hallway was freezing, yet the door felt alive. He told himself to walk away, but when he leaned closer, he noticed an old rusted key hanging from a nail beside the doorframe, so dusty and corroded that it looked like it hadn't been touched since the Nixon administration. Yet when he took it in his trembling fingers, the metal felt warm, almost pulsing, as if it had been waiting just for him. And despite every rational part of his brain screaming to stop, he slid the key into the lock, hearing the old mechanism groan like a creature waking up from a long sleep. And when he slowly pushed the door open, a rush of icy air spilled out, the kind of cold that didn't belong in any functioning hospital in America, the kind of cold found in sealed basements and forgotten morgues. And the smell was worse. Sterile, yes, but also faintly metallic, like blood that had dried decades ago. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness to reveal a room frozen in time, one that had clearly once been used for psychiatric restraints, with a single metal-framed bed bolted to the floor, leather straps hanging from its sides, an old IV pole with peeling paint leaning in the corner, and in the center of the bed lay a motionless figure covered neatly with a white sheet, arranged far too carefully to be an accident or oversight. And Arin's mind raced, because bodies in U.S. hospitals never went unrecorded, untagged, or abandoned, especially not in sealed rooms, so whatever this was, it was wrong on every possible level. He took slow steps forward, and the air thick with a suffocating heaviness, and as he reached the bedside, his flashlight trembled in his hand, because something about the sheet felt off. It wasn't dusty, it wasn't wrinkled, it was fresh, clean, like someone had tended to the body recently. And when he finally lifted the sheet enough to see the face underneath, he recoiled. The man's skin was pale, gray, and stretched tightly over his skull, his eyes shut so firmly it looked like he had died in agony, his lips cracked as though mid-whisper, his expression horrified rather than peaceful. And just as Arin tried to step back, his flashlight flickered violently, and the corpse's eyes snapped open with a lifeless, glassy stare directly into his eyes, making him stumble backward into the wall as a dry, rattling whisper escaped the corpse's frozen throat. "You came back," it said, voice brittle and faint, like wind scraping across broken glass. And Arin's breath hitched, because the words weren't random. They were directed at him, spoken with certainty, with recognition. And before he could form a thought, the corpse's lips cracked open again as it hissed, "You left me here. You left me to die." And Arin shook his head frantically, his voice trembling as he tried to speak but failed, because deep inside a clawing sense of déjà vu slithered through him, a feeling that the dead man somehow knew him, not as Arin Malone, the young doctor, but as someone else entirely, someone who had stood in that same room decades before.
Arin's pulse hammered in his ears as the corpse's breath rattled through the stale air, the sound unnatural, too dry, too ancient, as if the lungs producing it had no business functioning anymore. And yet the dead man spoke again with escalating clarity. "You walked away. You shut the lights off. You locked the door. and Arin shook his head over and over because none of it made sense. He wasn't alive when this happened. He wasn't responsible. He had never even been inside Crescent Hill Medical Center before applying for residency. But the corpse seemed blind to logic, its fixation absolute, its sunken eyes reflecting a recognition that felt older than Arin himself, and the pressure building inside the room intensified, an invisible force pushing against his chest, squeezing his lungs, a weight that made him sink to his knees while the corpse continued to rise, its bones cracking softly beneath its decomposed skin as it sat upright on the bed, its head tilting like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. And in that moment, Arin felt a sudden stabbing pain behind his eyes, sharp enough to make him gasp. And with that pain came flashes, brief, fragmented images that didn't belong to him. A doctor from decades ago wearing a long white coat stained with blood, his face strangely similar to Arin's, but older, sharper, colder. A restrained patient strapped to the same bed, screaming for help as the doctor turned away, the sound of the door locking and the lights going dark, the echo of the patient's voice begging through the door until it faded into silence. And then another flash, the doctor walking down the hallway, expression empty, unaware or uncaring that the man inside would never see sunlight again. Arin cried out as the visions tore through him, collapsing fully onto the floor, and when the flashes finally stopped, he gasped for breath, palms pressed against the cold tile, but the corpse wasn't done with him. No, its skeletal feet scraped across the floor as it stood up, each step impossibly slow, yet devastatingly deliberate as it approached him. And Arin crawled backward until his spine hit the door he had foolishly opened, his hand scrambling for the knob only to find it unmovable, frozen in place like the room itself had sealed him inside, trapping him in a chamber of history that wasn't his but was somehow bound to him all the same. The corpse crouched beside him, its hollow face inches from his, and whispered in a voice layered with centuries of resentment, "Your blood abandoned me. Your blood must take my place." And Arin's mind reeled. Your blood? And suddenly everything connected in a sickening jolt. The old family photos, the stories his father used to tell him about Arin's grandfather working in a troubled hospital during his early years, the way his father avoided discussing what happened before the family moved states, the way his grandfather refused to be photographed during the last years of his life, and worst of all, the faint resemblance between the man in the flashback and the portrait Arin had seen once in an attic when he was 10 years old. This room wasn't haunting him. It was haunting the man who had been here before, the man whose blood ran through his veins, the man who locked the patient in room 13 and left him to rot. The corpse's hand shot out with shocking speed, gripping Arin's wrist with fingers so cold it felt like being plunged into ice water, and he screamed as the touch sent needles of pain up his arm, but he kicked, twisted, and yanked with everything he had until he somehow tore free, stumbling to his feet and running blindly into the darkness of the windowless room, flashlight still in his hand, casting chaotic beams across the ceiling as he screamed for help, for anyone, for anything, though no one could hear him through the thick sealed door. The corpse lunged with unnatural jerks of movement, its limbs bending at impossible angles, and Arin crashed into the metal bed, knocking the IV pole to the ground as he desperately searched for something, anything to defend himself. But the only objects in the room were relics of abandonment, reminders that the room had been frozen in time with the singular purpose of punishing whoever dared open it. When the corpse lunged again, Arin threw the metal IV pole with adrenaline-fueled strength, striking the figure square in the chest, sending it sprawling back onto the bed with a sickening thud. And instead of buying him time to escape, the impact seemed to enrage the entity further, its limbs twitching violently as it rose again, faster and more determined, its voice no longer a whisper, but an echo that rattled through the walls themselves. "A Malone locked me here. A Malone must stay." And the sound was so thunderous that dust fell from the ceiling tiles, the temperature dropped further, and the pressure in the room intensified until Arin felt like his ribs were about to crack. With one final surge of terror-fueled instinct, he turned and slammed his shoulder into the door, again and again ignoring the pain radiating through his bones, and on the third strike the lock, rusted, ancient, decayed, snapped just enough for the door to budge, and Arin squeezed through the narrow gap as he hurled himself into the hallway, falling hard onto the polished floor, gasping like a man who had just escaped drowning. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back, but the sound of the corpse's hands dragging along the floor followed him, a scraping, clawing rhythm that grew louder and closer with each passing second, and he slammed his fist against the hallway alarm button, causing red emergency lights to burst into life, bathing the corridor in a hellish crimson glow as nurses and security personnel rushed toward him, shouting questions he couldn't process. But before he could speak, before he could tell them what happened, the dragging sound stopped. The hallway went silent, and when the staff finally reached room 13 and pulled the door fully open, the room was empty, the corpse gone, the bed neatly arranged once more, the air deadly cold but still, and every eye in the room turned to Arin with a look that blended confusion, disbelief, and fear. The hospital administration insisted the old wing had been sealed for decades, that no patient had been kept there since before the fire, that no one, alive or dead, should have been inside. But Arin knew what he saw, what he heard, what touched him, what spoke his name. And when he demanded the truth, demanded records, demanded anything that could explain the connection between his family and room 13, he discovered the final horrifying confirmation in an old, forgotten archive photograph. His grandfather standing in that same hallway, wearing that same white coat, with the same cold expression Arin had seen in the visions, and behind him, barely visible in the grainy background, was the restrained patient, alive, terrified, screaming for help just days before he died alone. Arin resigned from Crescent Hill Medical Center within a week, but the nightmares followed him home every night at exactly 2:45 a.m. He woke to the sound of dragging footsteps outside his bedroom door, and sometimes, when the lights flickered twice, he swore he could hear a whisper leaking through the cracks of the wood, "Your blood owes me?" And although he moved states months later, changed his phone number, changed jobs, changed everything, he could never outrun the cold truth that clung to him like a shadow. Room 13 didn't need a building or a bed or a hospital anymore. It only needed him. And sooner or later, whether in this house or the next, whether tonight or years from now, the patient who died alone would return for what was promised, the life of a Malone left behind in the dark.